Archives do not burn, they smolder. For decades, they hold stories too terrible to become public knowledge and too important to be forgotten. In 1968, while clearing rubble in the old Gestapo building in Dresden, construction workers stumbled upon a steel capsule sealed within a wall. Inside, amidst the decay and ash, lay the personal diary of SS Standartenführer Dietrich von Arnsberg, dated 1943. Most of the entries were a meticulous list of punitive operations, dry statistics of executions. But the last pages, written in a ragged, insane hand, did not speak of fighting partisans, they spoke of ghosts. "They are not human," Arnsberg wrote the day before his suicide. "They are the gray plague coming from the swamps. They have no banners, no communications, no supplies. They are not listed in a single report of the Red Army. We are fighting an army of the dead, spawned by this cursed forest itself. We christened them the Phantom Division. But even this name does not convey the full horror. They are commanded by a shadow we call the Grey Wolf. And I know that tonight, he is coming for me." What caused a career SS officer, a veteran of the Death's Head Division, to lose his mind? What force, unmarked on any one staff map, was operating in the impassable forests of Polesie? To find the answer, we must return to the bloody cauldron of autumn 1942, to the place where the Soviet command sacrificed an entire army, and where, from the ashes of that sacrifice, something was born that no one expected. Not Stalin, not Hitler. The story of the division that never existed. Autumn 1942. The Rozhev meat grinder was chewing up division after division. Stavka, Soviet High Command, demanded diversionary strikes on other fronts at any cost. One of these strikes was to be carried out by the forces of the Second Shock Army in a heavily forested and marshy sector of the front. The operation, initially conceived as a daring breakthrough, turned into a slaughter from the very first hours. German intelligence, the Abwehr, knew everything about the impending offensive, the time, the place, the forces. In the Wehrmacht archives, reports would later be found predicting with cynical accuracy, "The Russians are walking right into the bag themselves." And so it happened. Flanking strikes by German panzer wedges cut off the advancing group from the main forces. Tens of thousands of soldiers found themselves surrounded. Among them were 3 penal battalions and 2 penal regiments, thrown at the very tip of the attack. Nearly 5,000 men, for whom the war was already a last chance, now had not even that left. One of the consolidated penal regiments was commanded by Major Kirill Belov. He was an atypical figure for a penal battalion, neither a criminal nor a coward. A former rifle division commander, a tactical genius who had developed several successful operations in 41. His career ended in a single day. In the case file number 48, T112, it would later be recorded. For defeatism displayed at the front headquarters, and direct insult to a member of the military council, demote to major, and send to a penal regiment to atone for guilt with blood. Contemporaries recalled that the insult consisted of Belov, having studied the maps, stating directly to a general, Stavka's adjutant, that the offensive plan was a guaranteed cauldron and the senseless death of tens of thousands of men. He was not shot only because experienced commanders were worth their weight in gold. He was simply sent to die alongside those whose fate he had predicted. And now, in the rotten, damp forest, his prophecy had come true with terrifying accuracy. The ring of encirclement was tightening. Ammunition was running out. There was no food at all. Radio contact with the mainland, friendly territory, had died 3 days ago, cut off mid-sentence during the order, "Hold to the last man, help is coming." But help was not coming. Everyone understood this. The air over the cauldron was clear. Not one Soviet aircraft. Instead, German Ramas, FW-189 reconnaissance planes, hung over the forest from morning till night, correcting artillery fire. Belov sat in a hastily dug dugout, more like a foxhole. Near him were the remnants of his officer staff, Captain Lebedev, the former regimental artillery chief, his face earthy gray, his arm bound with a dirty rag where shrapnel was lodged, and political commissar Morozov, a fanatic with burning eyes, who even now, in hell, continued to drone on about duty to the motherland and the party. "Major, we must raise the men for an attack! Break out fighting!" Morozov rasped. Belov silently stared at the map. The map was useless. It showed what no longer existed. Front lines, friendly units, supply routes. Now it was just a piece of paper with a death sentence drawn on it. "Break out where, Polytruk?" Belov asked quietly, almost without emotion. "To the east, there are 3 SS divisions and a panzer wedge. To the west, the same. We are in the center of a firefight. Any attack is not a breakthrough. It is mass suicide." Eyewitnesses said that Belov barely slept in those days. He constantly walked the positions, talking to the fighters. And the fighters were diverse. A third were demoted officers, just like him. A third were politicals, under Article 58. And the most dangerous, unpredictable third, hardened criminals, Urki, thieves, for whom both the Soviet authorities and the Germans were equal enemies. Their informal leader was a man nicknamed Kostil, Crutch, a former thief-in-law serving time for banditry, cruel, smart, with a wolf's grip and complete contempt for any authority. He and his men were obeying for now, but rebellion was already brewing in their eyes. They felt that soon, orders would cease to mean anything. Soon, the main law would be the law of the strong. At night, 2 penal soldiers were dragged to Belov. They had tried to desert to the Germans. Defectors. By the laws of wartime, execution on the spot. Morozov was already preparing his pistol, but Belov stopped him. He approached the soldiers, who were trembling with fear, and asked one question. "Why?" One remained silent. The second, stammering, muttered, "At least they'll feed us there, Comrade Major." Belov looked at them for a long time, then turned to the guards. "Give them your rations for today," he ordered, "and then shoot them." Cruelty? No. It was a lesson for all the others. A lesson that, in this forest, was understood better than any slogan. There is no hope. Surrendering is not an option. The enemy is everywhere. But he was not going to die here, in the rotting leaves under the fire of German howitzers. A plan was already maturing in his head. A plan so insane that neither Berlin nor Moscow had considered it. If there is no help, if the order to hold to the last is just a euphemism for die quietly, then he ceases to be a soldier of the Red Army. He and his 5,000 outcasts would become something else. A third force. A force that would fight not for the motherland and not for Stalin, but for only one thing, for life, and by their own laws. But to do that, they first had to survive this night. And the German artillery began a methodical, grid-by-grid bombardment of the forest. The shells landed closer and closer. The earth trembled. The end seemed inevitable. Dawn arrived like a gray, indifferent shroud. The artillery barrage stopped. The Germans did not attack. They knew there was no rush. Hunger, disease, and despair would finish off the surrounded men faster than any assault. The forest was littered with fresh craters and bodies. The silence was broken only by the groans of the wounded. Belov climbed out of his hole. During the night, his regiment had lost another 200 men. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what he saw in the eyes of the survivors. Emptiness, complete apathy. Military discipline, the last rod that held this mass of people together, was bursting at the seams. According to the interrogation protocol of one of the surviving penal soldiers, captured by the Germans a week later, the disintegration began that morning. Men wandered off into the forest in small groups. No one listened to the commanders anymore. They were looking for food. Some ate bark from the trees, others began looking at the wounded. The chaos grew like an avalanche. Small groups, mostly of ex-convicts, began robbing the even weaker ones, taking their last crumbs of food and bullets. Several short, furious skirmishes broke out. This was no longer a regiment. It was a pack of feral, hungry dogs. Belov realized he had only a few hours to turn the situation around, or they would devour each other long before the Germans arrived. He gave an order to his last remaining runner. Gather everyone who could still walk, officers, sergeants, everyone, to the clearing, immediately. An hour later, about 300 men had gathered in a large clearing, hidden from aerial observation. The remnants of the command staff from various battalions, and those who simply, instinctively, gravitated toward order. Among them was Kostel with his bratva, crew, about 50 of the most inveterate Urki. They stood apart, looking at everyone with an insolent smirk. They had not come to obey. They had come to see what would happen next, and perhaps to take power into their own hands. Belov climbed onto a fallen tree. His tunic was torn, his face gaunt and covered in stubble. but his eyes burned with a cold, furious energy. "We have been abandoned," he began without preamble. His voice was quiet, but in the dead silence of the clearing, everyone heard him. "The order to stand to the death means we have been written off. There will be no help. To Moscow, we are already dead men. To the Germans, we are game in a pen. We have 3 paths. The first is to die here from hunger and shells. The second is to go and surrender, where we will either be shot as penal soldiers or left to rot in the camps. And there is a third path." He paused, scanning the faces of the men. "To stop being Penal Regiment number 713. To stop waiting for orders. From this day on, we are not an army. We are a pack. And we will live by the law of the pack. Here, in this forest, we will create our own state, with its own order and its own rules. And the first rule is simple. Everything we have is communal. Food, ammunition, medicine. Anyone who tries to steal even a crumb of bread from a comrade is an enemy and will be killed on the spot." A chuckle passed through the crowd of criminals. Kostel stepped forward. "You speak beautifully, Nachalnik, Chief," he rasped, grinning with rotten teeth. "But your words are water. We, the free people, have our own law, and we have lived by it and will continue to live by it. Whoever is strongest is right." He demonstratively tapped the handle of the finca, finish knife, stuck in his belt. It was a direct challenge. The entire clearing froze. The fate of this newborn pack was being decided right here, right now. If Belov backed down, his authority would be destroyed. Morozov, standing nearby, reached for his holster, but Belov stopped him with a gesture. He looked at Kostel calmly. "You are right," he said. "Whoever is strongest is right. But strength is not in a knife. Strength is in organization. Your 50 men can knife 50 sleeping men. But my 200 organized fighters with rifles will shoot you all down in 5 minutes, and you know it. And tomorrow, the Germans will shoot us all, because we will be busy tearing each other apart." He jumped down from the tree and walked right up to Kostel. "I am not offering power. I am offering life. You and your men are the most experienced. You know how to survive. You will become our reconnaissance, our special forces. You will get the best share of the loot, but you will obey the common law. One for all." Kostel was silent. His small eyes bored into Belov. He was weighing the odds. He could kill the major now, but the man was right. Without him, this rabble would turn into an uncontrollable herd that the Germans would slaughter in a couple of days. And the offer was tempting. To become the elite in this forest army. That was better than being a common frayer, sucker. "Fine, Major," he finally forced out. "I'm with you, for now. But if your laws don't suit us—" He left the threat hanging. Belov nodded. "I understand." It was a fragile wolf's alliance, but it was a start. That same day, the first order of the Phantom Division, as they were already mentally calling themselves, was announced. Order number 1. First, a total collection of all weapons, ammunition, and provisions, the creation of centralized depots. Second, the formation of combat units of 10 men, a 10 led by the most experienced commanders. Third, and most important, the introduction of the strictest discipline for theft from one's own, desertion, or failure to obey an order: death. The trial is short. The sentence is carried out immediately. As one of the eyewitnesses later recalled, it was more terrifying than any tribunal. At a tribunal, at least there was a piece of paper, an investigation. Here it was the major's word, and they'd lead you behind the trees. A minute later, one shot, and everyone understood. This was not a game. That evening, the new law was tested by blood. 2 of Kostel's men, not believing the seriousness of the situation, tried to break into a crate of canned goods at the common depot. They were caught. Kostel himself came to Belov. "They are my men, Major. I'll deal with them myself." Belov shook his head. "No. The law is one for all, and the sentence will be public." The thieves were led out to the same clearing. Belov ordered Kostel to carry out the sentence himself, in front of hundreds of men. Kostel turned pale but understood that this was a test of his loyalty to the new order. He drew his pistol. 2 shots rang out. From that moment on, there were no more red commanders or thieves in the forest. There were only Belov's soldiers. The state, born of despair, began its bloody history. But to live, this state needed resources. Lots of resources. And they could only be taken from one place: the enemy. Hunger is the great equalizer. It torments hero and criminal alike. By the end of the third day of the forest state's existence, the crumbs gathered from the pockets and kits of 5,000 men ran out. Brews made of bark and moss were no longer enough. The men were weakening. The wounded were dying not so much from their wounds as from starvation. Belov knew, another couple of days, and his iron discipline would crumble to dust in the face of starvation. They needed loot, large and immediate. A coded message from the German 12th Army Corps sent during those days has been preserved in the archives. In the swamp region south of the M1 highway, activity by scattered enemy groups is noted. They do not pose a threat. Mopping up of the cauldron continues. The Germans were convinced that the surrounded men were demoralized and capable only of chaotic breakout attempts in small groups. They did not yet know that they were dealing not with scattered groups, but with a single, desperate organism, controlled by a cold, calculating will. Belov spent several days glued to the map, marking data brought by the scouts from Kostel's unit. The Urki turned out to be born pathfinders. Silent, unseen, they infiltrated German cordons, bringing back priceless information. Their reports were far from standard regulations. Kostel would simply poke a dirty finger at the map. Here, Nachalnik, the Fritzes are fixing the road. About 40 men. The guards are sleepy militiamen. And over here, to the village of Kyorny Ruchi, Black Creek, a truck with bread and canned goods comes 2 times a day, brings chow for their HQ, which is set up in the school. The village, the HQ, that was too risky for the first operation. But the truck, that was the target. Belov looked at the map. The road to Kyorny Ruchi passed through a dense forest, making a loop near an old peat bog, the perfect place for an ambush. In the case files, it would later be recorded that it was at this moment that Major Belov first used the tactic that would become the calling card of the Phantom Division. A strike at the most unexpected, most vulnerable spot, with maximum cruelty and speed. No heroism, no full-height charges. Only the efficiency of a predator. He selected 70 men for the operation, the best of the best. The corps was formed by Kostel's men, reinforced by a dozen former reconnaissance officers. The plan was simple and daring. One group, armed with the only surviving Degtyaryov machine gun, was to block the road from one side. A second group, with the bulk of the fighters, would lie in wait along the road at the ambush site. A third, the smallest, would move to the rear to cut off the path of retreat. Belov personally led the operation. Contemporaries recalled that he was transformed in battle. Calm, almost apathetic in the rear, he became a bundle of nerves and energy. His orders were short, precise, and permitted no argument. He placed his men like chess pieces, checking the firing sector of every fighter. Fire only on my command. Let the truck get as close as possible. Destroy the driver and the guards in the cab first. Do not fire on the tires or the engine. We need the truck, not a pile of iron. They waited for almost 4 hours. The tension was almost tangible. For many, this was the first fight in their new status. Not as soldiers, but as forest bandits fighting for food. Finally, the roar of an engine was heard. A German 3-ton Opel Blitz appeared on the road. 2 men sat in the cab, 4 more in the open bed, lazily puffing on cigarettes. A typical rear echelon supply team, relaxed and confident in their safety. The Opel entered the kill zone. Belov raised his hand. The seconds dragged on like hours. When the truck was no more than 50 meters away, he sharply lowered his hand. The forest exploded with fire. The very first burst from the Degtyaryov tore through the driver and the officer next to him. The soldiers in the back didn't even have time to understand what was happening before they were cut down by heavy fire from both sides of the road. The fight lasted no more than a minute. Eyewitnesses said it was not a battle, but an execution. Not one shot was fired from the German side. When all was quiet, the penal soldiers emerged from the forest. Their eyes burned with a hungry, feverish gleam. They rushed toward the truck. Belov stopped them with one shout. "Halt! Inspection first!" He knew they couldn't relax, but everything was clear. In the truck bed, under the canvas, were crates. Dozens of crates. Bread, canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, schnapps. for men who had been chewing bark for days. But there was something even more important. In the cab, on the dead officer, Belov found a field bag with documents. A map with the locations of German rear units, commandantures, local headquarters, depots, and transport schedules. This wasn't just food. It was the key to survival. The key to dozens more operations just like this. That evening, there was a feast in the camp of the Phantom Division. For the first time in many days, the men ate their fill. But this was not just supper. It was a baptism by fire. They had shed their first blood not as soldiers, but as a pack. They understood that they could survive. Moreover, they could inflict damage on the enemy. This small but daring operation also had one other, far more important consequence. At the headquarters of the 12th Corps, the disappearance of the supply truck was blamed on partisans. But the report noted, they acted atypically. They did not take weapons, only provisions and documents. They killed everyone, leaving no witnesses. The signature is professional and cruel. The Germans did not yet know who they were dealing with, but the shadow of the Phantom Division had already fallen upon these forests. And with every day, it would grow longer and more terrifying. The success of the first raid breathed life into the men. But Belov did not let them relax. He understood that the euphoria from a full bowl of soup would pass quickly, but the problems would remain. 5,000 men. This is not a partisan detachment that can hide in the woods. This is an entire division, albeit one without banners. It needed to be fed, armed, healed, and, most importantly, housed somewhere. Staying in one place was tantamount to suicide. Sooner or later, German search parties would stumble upon their trail. They needed to find a base, impregnable, hidden from enemy eyes, capable of holding thousands of men. Studying the captured map, Belov noticed a huge gray spot in the very center of the forest massif, marked with the German words Sumpfgebiet, marshland, the Great Marshes, a god-forsaken place where neither locals nor especially German troops ever ventured. Impassable quagmires, bogs, surrounded by thousands of hectares of dense forest. For a regular army, it was death. But for his phantom army, it could become a home. He gave the order to move. The entire camp packed up and moved deeper into the forest, toward the swamps. It was an exhausting march. The weakened and wounded were carried on makeshift stretchers. They walked at night, observing the strictest light and sound discipline. By day, they hid in the densest thickets. Kostel and his scouts moved ahead, feeling out the path and posting sentries. According to the memoirs of one of the participants of this trek, we moved like ghosts. No one spoke. All that could be heard was the rustle of feet on fallen leaves and heavy breathing. The major had introduced an iron rule. Anyone who lights a smoke at night or makes a loud sound will be shot on the spot without warning. After 3 days, they reached the edge of the Great Marshes. The sight was depressing. As far as the horizon stretched stunted vegetation, rusty water, and quagmire, over which hung a thick fog. But Kostel's scouts found what Belov was looking for. Several large forested islands in the middle of the swamps, connected by barely visible, half-submerged log paths known only to old hunters. It was the perfect refuge. And here, construction began. Belov, using his pre-war experience as an engineer, organized the work with military methodicalness. The forest rang with the sound of axes. Thousands of hands felled trees, dragged logs, and dug earth. In a few weeks, a true fortified camp rose up in the middle of the impassable swamps. Dugouts were built for housing, capable of sheltering all the men. A separate hospital where the few medics, under the guidance of the regimental Dr. Ginsberg, worked miracles, operating with captured German instruments. A command dugout was erected for Belov and his staff. But most importantly, workshops were created. Weapons workshops, where one working rifle was assembled from 3 broken ones, where mines were artisanally crafted from unexploded shells, a cobbler's, a tailor's. Everything that could be repaired was repaired. Around the camp, on all the islands and paths, an ingenious defense system was created. Camouflaged wolf pits, trap holes, listening posts, firing points for machine guns. Eyewitnesses said that Belov personally inspected every meter of the defensive structures. He was turning the swamp into a fortress. Parallel to the construction, the internal organization of the forest state was proceeding. Belov finalized the structure of his army. He divided all fighters into three categories. The first, the most numerous, was the garrison. They carried out guard duty and worked in the camp. The second, the getters, providers, strike teams, under the command of Captain Lebedev and other experienced officers, who conducted regular raids beyond the swamps. They attacked German columns, smashed small commandantures, and obtained provisions, weapons, and medicine. Their tactics became increasingly sophisticated. False retreats, ambushes, night raids. They appeared from nowhere and disappeared into nowhere, leaving behind corpses and burned equipment. The third, the elite caste, Kostiel's scouts. His wolves were the eyes and ears of the division. They went tens of kilometers from the swamps, conducted surveillance, recruited agents in the villages, and brought back intelligence on the movements of large German units. But not everything was smooth. Inside this closed-off little world, its own passions seethed. Political Commissar Morozov, seeing that Belov was building not a Soviet partisan detachment, but something else entirely, tried to play his own game. He gathered former communists around him, tried to agitate, to remind them of their oath. In the case file opened on Morozov after the war, his testimony exists. I saw Major Belov creating a bandit formation. He did not mention Stalin or the party. His law was higher than Soviet laws. I considered it my duty to oppose this. The conflict reached its peak when Morozov demanded that Belov establish contact with the underground and submit to the orders of the central headquarters of the partisan movement. Belov summoned him to his dugout. The conversation was short. "Listen, Commissar," Belov said, looking him straight in the eyes. "To the central headquarters, we are deserters and traitors who were supposed to rot in that cauldron. If we make contact, the first thing they will send here is not help, but a smersh detachment to execute us all. We have our own headquarters here, and as long as I am in command, there will be no other authority." He offered Morozov a choice. Either he becomes the chief of the division as Special Department, responsible for internal security and counterintelligence, using his skills as a political worker, or Belov did not finish. Morozov understood. He chose life and power, even if it was in this strange new hierarchy. Thus, the former ideologue became the secret police chief of the swamp state. His task was to identify traitors, alarmists, and German agents, and he carried it out with the same fanatical cruelty with which he had once quoted Marx. The system Belov had created was now complete. It was cruel, but it was effective. It allowed them to survive. But beyond the swamps, the enemy was beginning to understand that they were facing something more than just a band of encircled men. By the beginning of winter 1942-1943, the activities of the Phantom Division were no longer just an annoying nuisance for the German rear. It was a systemic threat. Weekly reports of daring raids landed on the desks at Army Group Center headquarters. A bridge on a strategically important road, destroyed. A convoy with winter uniforms, burned. A garrison in a remote village, wiped out. A fuel depot, smashed. The signature was one and the same: a lightning strike, maximum damage, and an immediate withdrawal into the impassable forests. Eyewitnesses from the local population, interrogated by punitive squads, repeated the same thing. They came out of the fog, silently. There are many of them. Their faces are gray. Their clothing is mixed, ours and German. They are led by a tall man with icy eyes. They don't rob the peasants. They only take what they need. But the Germans and the Polesie, local collaborators, they kill every last one. The Germans could not understand what this force was. Partisan detachments operated differently. They derailed trains, carried out sabotage on communication lines, but avoided direct confrontations. These men, on the contrary, sought battle, imposing their own rules. Berlin grew concerned. The security of Army Group Center's rear was under threat. At one of Hitler's staff meetings, as is clear from surviving transcripts, the problem of the swamp bandits was raised with the Führer personally. The reaction was predictable. Hitler flew into a rage and demanded this infection be burned out with a red-hot iron. To carry out this task, one of the best anti-partisan specialists in the entire Third Reich was dispatched to the Great Marshes region, SS Standartenführer Dietrich von Arnsberg, the same man whose diary would be found a quarter-century later in Dresden. Arnsberg was not just a soldier, he was a hunter. Tall, aristocratic-looking, with a monocle in his eye and a scar from a university duel on his cheek, he was a doctor of philosophy who quoted Nietzsche and, simultaneously, a ruthless killer. He did not recognize scorched earth tactics, considering them primitive. His method was the anatomy of a rebellion. He studied the enemy, his habits, his strengths and weaknesses, and then delivered a precise, surgical strike to the very heart. Upon arriving, Arnsberg's first act was to forbid all large-scale punitive operations. "You are chasing shadows, burning villages, and angering the local population, which then becomes a breeding ground for the bandits," he declared at a meeting with the local Wehrmacht command. He launched a massive intelligence operation. His people, dressed in civilian clothes, flooded the surrounding villages, listening, bribing, recruiting. He created special Jagdkommandos, hunter-killer teams, small, excellently armed and equipped units of the most experienced Jaegers, light infantry rangers, and trackers, capable of operating autonomously in the forest for weeks. His motto was, "To catch a wolf, one must think like a wolf." He meticulously analyzed every attack by the phantoms, and he began to notice patterns. The strikes were always carried out at a distance of no more than one night's march from the swamps, meaning their base is there. They never attacked large, well-fortified garrisons, meaning they are conserving men and ammunition. Their main target was always supplies, meaning they are cut off from the mainland. And so, Arnsberg developed his plan. He decided to play a game of chess with the unknown phantom commander, whom he had mentally dubbed the Grey Wolf. He ordered a small, lightly guarded convoy to be sent down one of the forest roads leading past the swamps, but it was bait. Several kilometers behind, out of visual range, moved 3 of his best Jagdkommandos, traveling light, and in the convoy itself, in one of the trucks under a canvas, a powerful radio station was hidden, along with an elite squad of submachine gunners. The plan was simple. As soon as the phantoms attacked, the radio operator would transmit the signal, and the Jagdkommandos would strike from the flanks and the rear, springing the trap. It was a classic wolf hunt, using bait and beaters. Belov, whose scouts had reported easy prey, could not help but take the bait. His men desperately needed ammunition, and according to the reports, the convoy was carrying just such a cargo. For the first time since the division's founding, he felt a slight unease. It was all too good. But need outweighed caution. He assigned one of his best units to the operation, under the command of Captain Lebedev. The ambush was set up according to all the rules. When the convoy entered the kill zone, the penal soldiers opened fire. The fight began swiftly. The guards were crushed, but when Lebedev's fighters rushed the trucks, the unexpected happened. The canvas on one of the trucks was thrown back, and several machine guns opened up from underneath it. Simultaneously, heavy fire opened up on the attackers from the flanks, from the forest. Lebedev's unit was caught in a crossfire. It was a perfectly planned trap. Lebedev, an experienced commander, understood this instantly. He gave the command to retreat, but it was already too late. Arnsberg's Jagdkommandos were closing the ring. The penal soldiers, accustomed to easy victories, faltered. But Lebedev managed to gather the remnants of his unit around him and organize a circular defense. A battle for survival began. For the first time, the Phantom Division was facing not sleepy rear echelon troops, but an enemy equal in strength and skill. This was the first clash of 2 wills, 2 intellects, Belov and Arnsberg. The Grey Wolf fell into the hunter's trap. And although Belov himself was far away at his base in the swamps, he understood that his opponent had changed. The game had become deadly dangerous. The fate of Lebedev's detachment and, possibly, the entire division hung by a thread. While Standartenführer Arnsberg was weaving his webs in the forests of Polesie, in distant Moscow, a curious document landed on the desk of Viktor Abakumov, the head of the Smersh Main Counterintelligence Directorate. It was a summary report compiled from interrogations of partisans who had come out of the German rear and radio intercept data. It spoke of a strange, unaccounted-for formation operating in the area of the Great Swamps. According to this data, the formation's numbers reached several thousand men. It was excellently organized, had iron discipline, and was waging its own war against the Germans, not obeying orders from the central headquarters of the partisan movement. The report quoted the words of one of the partisan commanders. They call themselves the Forest Brothers, but they are not ours. They fight fiercely, but they don't let anyone near. Their commander, a former career officer, hides his surname. Stern, silent. Their laws are wolf's laws. For the slightest offense, execution. They don't make contact with us. They say, we have our own war. For Smersh, such information was a red flag. An uncontrolled armed formation in the enemy's rear, consisting of former penal battalion soldiers and criminals, was a time bomb. Who were they? Heroes or traitors who had created their own bandit republic? Or maybe it was a cunning plan by German intelligence, which had created a pseudo-partisan detachment to fight the real partisans. In the offices at Lubyanka, they did not like ambiguity. Every phenomenon had to be either black or white, either one of ours or the enemy's. This phantom division did not fit into any framework. The decision was made quickly and in the spirit of the times. A special operational group was to be inserted into the Great Swamps area. The official task was to establish contact, assess the situation, and, if possible, subordinate the formation to the command of the Red Army. The unofficial main task was to find out who headed the detachment and, if his identity or actions were deemed hostile to Soviet power, to liquidate him. Senior Lieutenant of State Security Suslov, a man with the unremarkable appearance of an accountant and cold, expressionless eyes, was appointed as the group's leader. Suslov was one of Abakumov's best cleaners. He specialized in work on the other side of the front. His profile: liquidation, recruitment, provocation. With him were two more fighters, a sniper and a radio operator, both from the NKVD Special Reserve. At the end of January, 1943, on a dark southern night, their plane flew over the front line. 3 paratroopers were dropped several tens of kilometers from the swamps. A short report from the group's radio operator has been preserved in the Smersh archives. Landed successfully, beginning the mission. From that moment on, a new enemy appeared for Belov and his men. An enemy, perhaps, more dangerous than the Germans. An enemy who wore the same uniform, spoke the same language, and fired the same weapons. An enemy who didn't just want to kill them, but wanted to rip out the very soul of their forest brotherhood, forcing them back under the banners of the power that had already betrayed them one time. Suslov acted cautiously and methodically. He didn't go in head-on. Through local contacts, he reached a partisan detachment operating nearby. He introduced himself as a liaison officer from the center and began gathering information. The partisans spoke of the swamp dwellers with respect and fear. They fight like beasts, the detachment commander told Suslov. The Germans fear them like fire, but they are proud on their own. They say their commander is former Major Belov, the same one who was sent to the penal battalion before the war for telling a general the truth to his face. A smart man, but tough. They say he even traded with us. We give them salt and tobacco, and they give us captured German machine guns. Suslov listened attentively, his face remaining impassive. Belov. The surname was familiar to him. He looked up this major's pre-war file, talented but defiant and uncontrollable, an ideal candidate for the role of a forest czar. Suslov's task was becoming more complicated. Simply liquidating such a leader, who enjoyed undeniable authority among thousands of armed men, was dangerous. It could cause a riot and chaos, which would only play into the Germans' hands. He needed to act more subtly, and Suslov found a weak link. Politruk Morozov, the man who was formerly the second-in-command in the division, but whom Belov had stripped of real ideological power, turning him into the head of counterintelligence. A man with enormous ambitions and wounded pride. Suslov, through his network of agents, managed to pass Morozov a note. It contained only a few words. The motherland remembers you. If you are ready to fulfill your party duty, I will wait for you at the old mill in 2 days. Password: victory. For Morozov, this was a chance to return to the system, to be rehabilitated, to become useful to the party again. He found himself facing a choice: remain loyal to Belov, who had saved his life, but created a world alien to him, or betray him in the name of the ideals he still fanatically believed in. Meanwhile, Captain Lebedev's detachment, which had fallen into Arnsberg's ambush, was fighting an encircled battle with its last strength. Belov, having received a report about the operation's failure, was preparing a counterstrike to break the encirclement. He did not yet know that while he was trying to save his men from German bullets in his own rear and the soul of his closest comrade in arms, a time bomb of betrayal was already ticking, set by the hand of a ruthless Chekist from Moscow. To understand what these people were fighting and dying for, one had to look inside their world, hidden in the very heart of the great swamps. It was not just a military formation. It was a living, breathing organism, mutated under the pressure of inhuman circumstances. Its nervous system was Major Belov. Its muscles were the combat detachments, but it also had a soul, albeit a mangled one, full of contradictions. Daily life in the swamp camp was harsh and subject to a strict routine. Reveille before dawn, a meager breakfast, a bowl of thin gruel made from captured flour and dried mushrooms, then work. Some set off for the mainland on another mission. Others stood sentry duty, standing for hours in icy water on the approaches to the islands. A third group worked in the workshops or at logging. Idleness was not permitted. As one of Belov's unwritten laws stated, "He who does not work does not eat. He who does not fight works twice as hard." The center of camp life was Dr. Ginsburg's hospital. A doctor by the grace of God, a leading surgeon in Leningrad before the war, he had ended up in the Penal battalion because of a denunciation. In his dugout, dimly lit by a kerosene lamp, real miracles were performed. Without antibiotics, without proper instruments, using moonshine distilled from captured sugar as an antiseptic, he saved lives. Contemporaries recalled that Ginsburg could work for 2 days straight without sleep, removing shrapnel, stitching torn tissues, amputating shattered limbs with a common handsaw. He was the moral compass of this world. He did not divide people into formers and currents. For him, there were only patients. Often, after a difficult operation, he would sit by a wounded man's cot and simply talk to him about his past peaceful life, about books, about music. These conversations, as they whispered in the camp, healed better than any medicine. They reminded the men that they were still human, and not just forest beasts. Justice in Belov's state was swift and cruel. It was administered by the special department under Morozov's leadership. The former politruk found himself in this role. His men identified not only German spies, but also internal sedition. Any doubt in Belov's orders, any attempt to create a faction or sow panic was severely punished. Interrogations were conducted in a separate, deep dugout at the edge of the camp. Rarely did anyone return from there. However, there were almost no real crimes like theft or murder. Everyone understood the price for such things was one's life. One time, an exemplary incident occurred. One of the fighters, a former criminal, killed another in a drunken brawl over a captured watch. He was caught. Belov did not arrange a tribunal. He ordered the entire division to assemble, brought out the murderer, and placed him back to back with the man he had killed. "You took a soldier from us," he said quietly. "Now you will take his place." And he personally shot him in the back of the head. Everyone learned this lesson, but even in this harsh world, there was a place for life. There were about a dozen women in the division, mostly nurses and radio operators from decimated headquarters, who had been lucky enough to survive the encirclement. They were in a special position. Belov issued an order. Anyone who insulted or harmed a woman would be considered an enemy and punished by death. This order was strictly observed. The women were a symbol of that other life they had all lost. They worked in the hospital, mended clothes, and their presence softened the manners of the coarse, wild men. There were also their own holidays. When the foragers brought in a particularly rich haul, for example, crates of schnapps and chocolate, Belov would arrange a general feast. The men sang songs to a captured accordion and told stories. In those short hours, they forgot about the war and the death that awaited them beyond the swamps. Kostil's scouts were a special caste. They lived somewhat separately in their own sector of the camp. These were the most desperate and skilled fighters. Their work was the most dangerous. They didn't just gather information, they waged their own quiet war. In the case files of Standartenführer Arnsberg, there is a mention that officers began disappearing in his rear. They were found later in the forest with their throats cut. This was the work of Kostil's wolves. They didn't take prisoners, they eliminated targets. A complex relationship existed between Belov and Kostil. It was not friendship. It was a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. Kostil recognized Belov's intellect and will. Belov valued Kostil's animal instinct and devotion to the common cause. "You, Chief, are the brains," Kostel once said to Belov, "and I am the fangs. As long as we are together, the pack is alive." And this pack lived. It bit into the enemy's body, growing stronger, more experienced. It created its own unique world with its own laws, its own morality, its own justice. But Belov, Kostel, and Dr. Ginsburg all understood that their world was an island in the middle of a raging ocean of war. And sooner or later, the waves of this ocean, be they German or Soviet, would reach them and wash their fragile state from the face of the earth. The battle of Captain Lebedev's detachment, which had fallen into Arnsberg's ambush, ended tragically. After holding out for almost a day and losing more than half their men, the remnants of the group managed to break the encirclement and escape into the forest. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. For the first time, the penal soldiers had encountered an enemy that was their equal in both skill and cruelty. This battle gave Arnsberg priceless information. He captured several severely wounded prisoners. According to the interrogation protocol, which is preserved in the German archives, one of them broke under torture and told everything. About the base in the swamps, about Major Belov, about the division's numbers and structure. Now Arnsberg knew his enemy's face. The Grey Wolf had gained a name. The hunter had received all the necessary information to deliver a fatal blow. He understood that he was dealing not with a gang, but with a full-fledged army. And to destroy it, appropriate forces were needed. He flew to the Army Group headquarters and got what he wanted. He was allocated 2 SS divisions, a regiment of the Brandenburg Army Special Forces, air support, and heavy artillery. The operation to destroy the Phantom Division received the cynical name Hexenhammer, Witch's Hammer. Arnsberg's plan was simple and effective. First, massive bombing of the swamps to destroy the fortifications, sow panic, and drive the phantoms deep into the quagmires. Then, a total blockade. The troops were to encircle the entire swamp area with a tight double ring, cutting off all escape routes. And after that, a methodical square-by-square sweep by Jagd commandos and special forces, who, unlike regular troops, knew how to fight in wooded marshlands. Arnsberg didn't just want to defeat the enemy, he wanted to demonstratively destroy and incinerate it, so that not even memories of the forest state remained. Kostel's reconnaissance was working at its limit. His wolves noticed the transfer of large German forces, a concentration of troops on the approaches to the forest. The reports landing on Belov's desk were one more alarming than the next. He understood. The enemy was preparing for a decisive assault. There was almost no time left to prepare a defense. He convened a council of war. All the commanders gathered in his dugout, Captain Lebedev with a bandaged head, the gloomy Kostel, Dr. Ginsburg, even Politruk Morozov. The atmosphere was oppressive. "We have 2 options," Belov said, looking at the map, which was covered in blue German arrows. "First, stay here and accept the fight. Our fortress is well fortified. We can hold out for a week, maybe 2. But then our ammunition will run out, and they will simply crush us with sheer numbers. The second option is to break out, abandon the camp and the wounded, and try to get out of the ring before it closes completely. The chances are not high." Silence hung in the dugout. To abandon the wounded, for many this was unthinkable. It violated the main law of their brotherhood. Dr. Ginsburg was the first to speak. "I will not abandon my people, Major," he said quietly but firmly. "I have more than 100 bedridden men. They will not survive a march. If we leave, we must take everyone." Kostel laughed hoarsely. "Where will we drag them, Doc? On our backs? They'll catch us with them in the first forest." "The chief is right. Either we sit here and die together, or we run for it. And the wounded? War is war." Opinions were divided. For the first time since the division's founding, its unity was broken. And at that very moment, Morozov, who had been silent until then, decided his hour had come. He secretly met with the Smersh senior lieutenant, Suslov. According to Suslov's post-war report, Morozov gave him full information about the Germans' plans and the discord in Belov's headquarters. "He is ready to cooperate," wrote Suslov, "but he fears Belov. He proposes a deal. He helps us take power in the division, and we guarantee him and his people a full amnesty and a return to the ranks of the Red Army." Suslov understood that this was his chance. He gave Morozov an order. At the War Council, he was to make a third proposal. not to defend and not to break out, but to request help from the partisans and the mainland. It was a cunning move. Belov, trusting no one, would most likely refuse, and then Morozov could accuse him of treason, of unwillingness to reunite with the motherland and split the division from within. The plan was diabolically clever. The next day, the council gathered again, and Morozov, as agreed, spoke. "Comrades," he began pathetically, "we have forgotten that we are Soviet people. Partisan brigades are operating nearby. We must unite with them. We must send a radio operator across the front line and demand help from command. Together, we will strike the Germans in the rear." Belov listened to him, and his eyes turned into two icy slits. He understood that these were not Morozov's words. Someone was skillfully playing on the men's moods, offering them false hope. And at that very moment, as the internal split reached its peak, a growing roar was heard over the swamps. Dozens of German bombers were flying at low altitude, straight toward their islands. Operation Witch's Hammer had begun. Belov no longer had time for arguments and internal investigations. The enemy was at the gates, and this enemy had come to kill them all. Hell descended on the swamps suddenly. The first wave of Junkers bombed the central island, where the headquarters and hospital were located. The earth buckled. Centuries-old pines snapped like matchsticks. Dugouts and bunkers collapsed, burying people beneath them. The air was filled with a roar, mixed with the screams of the wounded and the wails of the dying. After the first wave came a second, then a third. The German pilots methodically, square by square, plowed the islands with bombs. Eyewitnesses recalled that the black smoke from the fires and the peat thrown up by the explosions obscured the sky, turning day into twilight. The defense system that Belov had so carefully built was practically destroyed in the very first hours. The telephone wires connecting the islands were severed. Command and control of the troops was lost. Chaos and panic gripped the camp. The men, accustomed to partisan raids, were unprepared for the power of a regular army. A blast wave buried Belov in his dugout. They dug him out, shell-shocked, with blood running from his ears. The first thing he saw when he emerged onto the surface was ruins. His state, his fortress, had turned into a fiery hell. The hospital was destroyed. Dr. Ginsburg, risking his life, along with the surviving nurses, pulled the wounded from under the burning logs. The losses were monstrous. In one day of bombing, the division lost more men than in all the previous months of fighting. But this was only the beginning. After the aviation, the heavy artillery began to speak. The German guns, having ranged in, began a methodical bombardment of the paths and passages between the islands, cutting them off from one another. And at dawn the next day, the Jagd commandos went on the attack. They didn't advance head-on. They infiltrated in small groups, using smoke and fog as cover, and cut down the surviving pockets of resistance. Close combat began. A fight in the labyrinths of the swamps, where death could be hiding behind every tree. It was at this moment of chaos that Senior Lieutenant Suslov and Politruk Morozov struck their blow. Taking advantage of the fact that Belov was shell-shocked and communication between detachments was broken, Morozov gathered his supporters around him. "Belov has betrayed us!" he shouted. His eyes burned with a fanatical fire. "His stubbornness led us into this hell. He refused the motherland's help. Our only chance is to break out to the east, to link up with the partisans. Who is a Soviet man? Follow me!" He managed to rally about 500 men, those who were most frightened and demoralized. Suslov, remaining in the shadows, gave Morozov a clear plan for a breakthrough through one of the sectors he believed to be least guarded. But it was a trap. In Suslov's report, it would later be dryly noted. With the aim of identifying and neutralizing the most unreliable element, it was decided to direct Morozov's group to a sector of the German defense that was known to be under fire. Smersh had no intention of saving anyone. It was simply getting rid of the trash. Morozov and his men went for the breakthrough and ran straight into the crossfire of German machine guns. Out of 500 men, only a handful survived. Morozov himself was seriously wounded and captured. His mission had failed, but he had managed to stab the Phantom Division in the back, splitting off significant forces from it at the most critical moment. Belov, having regained his senses, learned of Morozov's betrayal, but he had no time for anger. He had to save those who remained, and no more than 2,500 fighters remained, trapped on several islands. The ring of the blockade was tightening. Arnsberg personally directed the operation from a forward observation post. He was confident in his victory, but he underestimated the fury of desperation. Belov gathered around him everyone who could still hold a weapon. Kostel with his wolves, the remnants of Lebedev's detachment, the garrison fighters. And he made the only possible decision, an insane decision. Not to defend, not to break out of the ring, but to attack. To attack those who were assaulting them, to strike at the very heart of the punitive operation. He calculated the location of Arnsberg's headquarters from the intensity of the radio traffic, and threw everything he had at it, about 1,000 men, the most desperate. "We will die anyway," he told his commanders. "So let us die not in the swamp like rats, but in battle. We will take as many of these bastards with us as possible. And if we're lucky, we'll get their leader." It was a gesture of desperation. The final, suicidal blow of the Phantom Army. At night, under the cover of fog, Belov's strike group silently took out the German sentries and rushed into the rear of the assaulting units, straight toward the headquarters of Standartenführer Arnsberg. They were not going for victory. They were going for revenge. The night attack on Arnsberg's headquarters became a legend, one that was later retold in whispers by both the surviving penal soldiers and German veterans. It was not a tactical operation. It was an explosion of primal fury. Bursting into the location of the German headquarters battalion, the penal soldiers fought with the madness of the doomed. They launched bayonet charges, hacked with sapper shovels, tore at the enemy with their teeth. Knives, finkas, and homemade grenades were used. Kostel's fighters, professional killers, cut a path for themselves toward the tent where the Standartenführer was, as would later be written in Arnsberg's diary. This was not an attack by soldiers, but an invasion of ghouls. They climbed out of the fog, silent, with eyes burning with hatred. They could not be stopped by fire. They walked over the bodies of their own men and ours. They were driven by one goal: to kill. Belov personally led his men into battle. He was wounded in the shoulder but seemed to feel no pain. He fired his machine gun, threw grenades, rallying his fighters by his example. Kostel fought beside him. The former thief-in-law and the former Soviet major, two opposites, became a single whole in this last, desperate battle. They managed to break through to the headquarters dugout itself. Arnsberg's guards, elite SS men, were cut down in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Kostel was the first to burst into the dugout, but Arnsberg was not there. A few minutes before the attack, sensing something was wrong, he had moved to a backup command post. This is what saved his life, but his headquarters was completely destroyed. Command of Operation Witch's Hammer was paralyzed for several hours. This attack cost the Phantom Division dearly. Of the 1,000 men who went on the breakthrough, no more than 200 returned to the swamp. But they had accomplished their main task. They had shown the enemy that they would not surrender. They had made the hunter fear his prey. It was this battle that broke Dietrich von Arnsberg. He was not physically harmed, but his mind, his aristocratic certainty of his own superiority, was destroyed. He had encountered a force he could not understand or classify. In his diary, he would write, "I looked into the eyes of one of the dying Russians. There was no fear in them, only contempt. I understood that we had not lost the battle. We lost this war the moment we created such men." The next day, he gave the order to retreat. The official reason given was a change in the operational situation at the front. In reality, he could no longer continue. The Phantom Division had won, but it was a victory on the edge of the grave. Of the 5,000-man army, no more than 500 men remained. Wounded, hungry, without ammunition, trapped in a ruined fortress. Their state was destroyed. Belov understood this was the end. They had won time, but not the war. The front line was approaching. Soon the Red Army would come, and then they would have to answer for their actions. He gathered the last survivors, Captain Lebedev, Dr. Ginsburg, Kostel, a handful of fighters. "We did everything we could," he said. "We survived. We took our revenge. Now, everyone must decide for himself." He gave them one last order, which was no longer an order but advice. He divided everyone into small groups of 5 to 10 men. "Leave," he said. "Disappear into the forests. Some may go west, some may join the partisans, some may try to reach our own lines, but the division is no more. The state has fallen. They asked him what he himself would do. I have my own path, Belov replied. He remained on the islands with Dr. Ginsburg and the non-transportable wounded. Kostel left with his men in an unknown direction. Captain Lebedev, with a small group of former officers, decided to break through to their own lines. The Phantom Division ceased to exist, melting away into the same fog from which it had been born. What became of the heroes of this forgotten drama? Fate scattered them like autumn leaves. Captain Lebedev and his group managed to reach the advancing units of the Red Army. As Belov had predicted, Smersh immediately arrested them. After long interrogations and checks, Lebedev, as a valuable specialist, was returned to service. He finished the war in Berlin, but he remained under the secret surveillance of the authorities for the rest of his life. He never told anyone about the Phantom Division. Politruk Morozov, who had been captured, was liberated by Soviet troops. He was tried for treason, but then the case was reviewed. Thanks to the testimony he gave against Belov and others, his execution was commuted to 25 years in the camps. He died in Vorkuta in 1953. Senior Lieutenant of State Security Suslov made a brilliant career, rising to the rank of KGB general. In his personal file, the operation in Polesie was noted as one of the most successful. Kostel's fate is lost in the post-war chaos. According to one version, he and his men never left the forests, creating one of the most brutal gangs, which terrorized the local authorities for several more years. According to another, he managed to legalize himself and disappeared into the vast country, becoming a kingpin of the criminal underworld in peacetime. His trail was never found. SS Standartenführer Dietrich von Arnsberg, as we know from his diary, could not survive his defeat. A defeat that was not military, but metaphysical. He committed suicide in his office in Dresden, leaving behind the only written testimony of the existence of the Phantom Army. And what about Major Kirill Belov? His fate is the main mystery of this story. When the advanced detachments of the Red Army entered the Great Swamps area, they found only traces of terrible battles and several hundred nameless graves on the islands. Belov, Dr. Ginsburg, and the wounded were not there. They had vanished. In the Smersh case files, there is a short entry. Major Belov KP is listed as missing in action. But among the people, in the remote villages of Polesie, a legend lived on for a long time. The legend of the Grey Wolf. It was said that he had not died, that he remained in the forests alone, and that sometimes, on foggy nights, hunters saw his silent shadow at the edge of the swamp. He became the spirit of this place, the eternal guardian of his fallen fortress. And the keeper of the memory of the 5,000 outcasts who left to die did not surrender, but created their own cruel but free state. A story that was not in any textbook. A story about the Phantom Division, born in hell and gone into the fog. And only the old yellowed pages of a German diary found in the ruins of Dresden remained its only silent witness, an echo of a long-past battle that even today makes us ask the question, where is the line between heroism and crime, between betrayal and loyalty when it comes to survival? The answer to that question is for everyone to find for themselves.